Can we have silence, please?
I'm really hot. I turned the fan off and closed the windows, and it's already boiling.
Well, let's get moving then.
Are you sweating?
I'm sweating.
Another thing I don't want to hear about. So many things I do not want to hear about you talking about.
Right, okay. Shut up, you two. Right, hello listeners and welcome to episode 32 of the Picky Bastards podcast, the miserable music podcast in which we find new and pettier ways of disagreeing with each other every month, while also listening to some music that we talk about a little bit. So, I'm Fran, I'm here with Matt. Hi Matt, how you doing?
Hello. How's it going?
What was that voice?
That was my old lady voice.
Okay, I liked it, okay. And I'm also here with Nick, who is very, very hungover today. So, hi Nick.
I am just dying here. This is going to be agony, I just want to point out. So thanks to all our listeners for putting themselves through it.
We're recording this on the 5th of July and the pubs opened last night and Nick was the first person in the queue. I think that's what happened.
Yeah.
I was drinking at
Going
home,
crazy.
Thank you very much. I was respecting social distancing properly.
So you weren't standing next to Nigel Farage in the queue?
I wasn't actually, no.
Okay, fair enough.
Another thing that's going to turn my stomach talking about Nigel Farage.
Yeah, that's the only time he will ever be mentioned on this podcast, hopefully.
Thank you.
Okay, so standard procedure, everybody. We've got 4 recent releases, 1 classic album, and I'm going to talk about an artist I love. So the recently released albums are Run the Jewels with RTJ4, LA Priest with Gene, Medhane with Cold Water, Yves Tumor with Heaven to a Tortured Mind, and the classic is Jill Scott with Who is Jill Scott. And then I'm going to tell you all why I love Tracy Chapman, and I just used her self-titled debut album for that. So I'm going to start with Nick today, and I'm going to ask Nick, which of these albums did you find the most accessible, and was that a good thing?
Okay, I'm going to go with most accessible is Run the Jewels 4. And definitely it was a good thing, actually. This album, I really warmed to it straight away, and I found it extremely... God, I'm not going to find words today, am I? I found it extremely... kind of catchy and sort of enjoyable straight away, like fun straight away. And yet, as I got further through it, I found it also really backed that up with some incredible complexity musically and lyrically, which I absolutely loved. So I really can't say enough good things about it, honestly. I thought it was absolutely banger after banger. It's so clever politically. It's musically really lush. It's really witty as well, lyrically, as well as being political. It has... So, I mean, the whole album is very, very consistent standard. I mean, it's really fabulous. And we did do the third one, didn't we? Didn't we do the third one some time ago?
Yeah, well, I'm wondering if, thinking back, that was when me, you and Nermal, before we were actually recording the podcast, when we used to just get together to chat about them. So I remember doing it, but I don't think we recorded an episode.
And I remember at that time thinking, oh, this is solid, this is good stuff. You know, I was kind of into it, but it wasn't a massive deal. But this is a huge step up, I think. I thought the best track on it was Walking in the Snow. That was the most sort of powerful. It had this kind of vicious guitar opening, which I thought was really nice and sort of punky. It has these crazy pitch bend samples. The flow is so tight. And as I say, the lyrical witticism and cleverness is all the way through, including ending up with this part at the end of one of the verses about how Jesus was killed by the state. Which I thought was just such a interesting way of spinning that, you know, and such a profound statement in some ways. I also love the Few Words for the Firing Squad, which is the last track on it. And I suppose this is all a preamble to say this is the best hip-hop album I've heard in a long, long time. And yes, I prefer it to Grey Area by Little Sims.
What? What? You're not allowed to prefer anything to Grey Area by Little Sims.
Sorry, this is... Yeah, that is in the shadow of this now, so there you go.
Does that mean we've now got a year of you saying this is in the shadow of Run the Jewels every time we listen to a hip-hop album?
This is what an album this is. It's fantastic. It was also first thing on the playlist, which was fantastic to sort of have that drop right in when you started playing it. It was, I can't say enough good things about it. Fantastic.
There you go. That's a pretty positive start. How about you, Matt?
I also love this album. I think it's a great album. But I think the biggest thing about it is obviously the timing. What it talks about is really ridiculously relevant. And so the content. Killer Mike's always been fantastic at talking and expressing concerns and about what's going on in the world, specifically for Black people and Black culture. But in this, they take on like similar topics to what they've talked about before, but because of the like the murder of George Floyd and the resulting protests, it like crystallized everything, because that happened just 1 week before the release of this album.
Yeah, it's amazingly topical. Isn't it? I totally agree with you. I can't believe it just feels like they recorded it that week, which is obviously not true.
Yeah.
But wow.
But I guess that just and I think it's like highlighted in some of the other albums as well. It's just one of those things. It keeps happening, and there's violence, and so it can be topical because of the violence, always being the police violence. But I guess the one thing about the this is like in Walking in the Snow. Like he talks about the inaction and how the insensitivity of people, because they see all this violence on our screens, but that I guess didn't happen this time, and people are out there protesting. But
then I suppose there's still that huge amount of people who are just doing that, I suppose, still, aren't there? So I suppose that's still...
But
obviously this time we've seen some difference, but I think even what I'm worried about now is a few weeks on we are seeing it quieten down, aren't we? So it's about, that's why these albums are so important, I suppose, to keep that going.
To keep the fire burning. Because and then I don't think you talked about the song with Zach De La Rocha and Pharrell. Like the line of like, look at all the slave masters posing on your dollar is like absolutely incendiary. It's just such a poignant and quick snap remark, and it's like wrapped up in this just absolutely like you say. I know we always talk about catchy in like a negative sense, and it's the word you used earlier, but it is just this like really like absolutely bomb track, and it has that as the center point to it. How many albums can be
that profound and also that much fun, really?
But that's I think all of their albums have aimed for this, and I'm not even sure if this is the best of their albums. I would generally put RTJ2 higher than this, but this album does aim for a more expansive sound. But pretty much every single video that you see them produce, and every single song that gets released as a single, has either a commentary on like the prison complex or police violence like embedded in it. So it's something that's integral to who they are. But yeah, for me, like going from RTJ3 to RTJ4, this is like really, I think, a step up, and better, more similar to RTJ2. It's more like the kind of the production style is more rough and ready and a bit more like, it just felt overblown, but like in a good way. So I loved it. And then the second track, the sample on Ooh La La, is just fantastic. I just love it so much.
Well, so brilliant.
It's great. Okay. So good.
Well, it's kind of now.
I hated it. No, I didn't. No, I kind of wondered whoever got to go talk about this album third, I thought was probably gonna have had all their points made already, which kind of have. But I suppose I'll start by saying I'd never really been massively into Run the Jewels before. I've listened to all of the albums previously and never really fully felt the draw of them. You know, I never totally fell in love, even though I recognised the talent and admired what they were doing. But I'm not sure what happened this time, but this album totally did it for me. I think partly it is what we're just talking about when it's landed, you know, being in lockdown and watching everything that's been happening, and then this album coming along. But I also think it's a perfect album for someone like me who's into some quite old school hip hop as well. I think there's some amazing samples, the scratching. It's almost like a homage at times to older hip hop. But as much as it sounds like an old school album, it is also the ideal album for the times we're living through. I think it feels so energetic all the way through, so empowering, so perfect for the current situation. But I'm going to go back to what Matt was talking about, the Pharrell track, the look at all these slave masters posing on our dollars. It just hits me every time he says that. And I read an interview with Killer Mike saying that, they'd been to Pharrell for a chorus expecting a kind of the pop hit from the album and something that would be sort of, the guy who wrote Happy and Get Lucky, to write them something that would be, a poppy hit. But, even Pharrell in this instance is writing hooks like that, it says a lot, I think, about the current time. And I'll go back to what you were saying about Walking in the Snow as well, Nick, because I think amazing song, it's so crucial and powerful right now. But I think a lot's been highlighted about, it's saying it features the line "I can't breathe," which is obviously what protesters have been chanting after George Floyd. Yeah. But this song was actually written about Eric Garner, which was 2 years ago now. So, while a lot of people are talking about this album being prescient, that isn't actually true. It's not prescient.
Gets the vocab award there for prescient. Well done.
Well, yeah, it's not predicting anything, is it? It's just documenting an ongoing situation that's getting more media right now. So I think that's really a good thing. And I think the current attention Black Lives Matter and police brutality is receiving needs to be ongoing. So like I was saying before, I think an album like this plays a huge part in that. So I think, it's massively taken them up in my estimation. And it's a fantastic album, as we've all said, really. And that's me, I think. Okay, so I'm going to go to Matt now. So which album did you find least accessible, and was that a bad thing?
I'm going to go with Medhane, with Cold Water. And I found this question quite hard to answer, and I'm going with Medhane less as a response to this album, but more as a response to the other albums, which I guess we'll get into. But I just found generally everything to be pretty accessible. And so in comparatively with Medhane, I found it very, so start off, I really like this album, but I just, getting into it initially, it's quite dry, and you compare it to some of the other stuff, specifically like, compare it to like Run the Jewels. Often they'd just be given the same category of hip hop, and they couldn't really be more different, really. The production in like RTJ 4 was like I said, was really kind of overblown, and it just felt like really in your face. Well, this was just so minimal and so kind of dry, that after coming from the previous albums, it just felt like so different. It was hard to adjust to. But that said, I really liked the way, like, his voice and his style. It felt like he had this very kind of effortless like and dreamy kind of flow. And sometimes he kind of swayed into more like the mumbly side of things, which also made it less accessible because it's harder to hear, or just a very purely practical sense. But it always felt very, even though it was slow, it felt very deliberate and purposeful. And I would compare this maybe more to someone like, I think when we talked about last time with Jay-Z, you compare like Killer Mike to Jay-Z, and Killer Mike is very like trying to get as many words in and this very intricate play, while Jay-Z steps it back and is very much taking his time to go over the flow in a very slow but methodical way. And so this felt more akin to that. That said, the style was wholly different, and it just felt very methodical and restrained. And so I generally really enjoyed this album. I also really enjoyed the beats, like it's kind of chill and jazzy at times. And I think I really liked the song. I think I did really like the song "Live" because it had this really great meandering bass that was.
Which
just
song
all
did you
over
say?
the
Sorry, I missed what song you.
"Live."
Yeah. Okay.
So that was really great. I guess the only drawbacks I really had of this is just because of his style. It just doesn't. He doesn't. Although he's very purposeful and methodical, it doesn't necessarily come across as like passionate because of that delivery style. So it is that thing of like, it doesn't draw you in and make you listen, but when you like sit with it, I think you get this kind of more heady and introspective vibe from it, which I enjoyed.
Okay, cool. I'm going to jump in because some of what you're saying ties into what I've said. So I'll start by saying I think this album kind of fits into a subsection of hip hop that I haven't always been really complimentary about on this podcast. I think it has quite a bit in common with the Earl Sweatshirt and the JPEG Mafia albums that we've covered previously. Yes. So what I mean by that is the slower flow that you were just talking about, Matt, and the intentionally sort of dense beats and an almost trippy vibe at times. So at first, and I think again what Matt said about this relates to the other albums on the playlist really. For me at first it was quite easy for me to lump this album with those other albums and albums that I didn't love and kind of, ignore it a little bit. But the more I listened to it, it ended up testing my preconceptions about that type of rap music really. I got more and more into this album with every listen, and I think it's still growing on me really. It took me a while to think about why that was, but the longer I spent with the album, the more I realised how much care is put into every element. So if we talk about the production, I think with the JPEG Mafia and the Earl Sweatshirt, I found them just quite muddy and quite sloppy in some respects, whereas this feels so precise. It feels like there's everything's on purpose and there's a lot of detail in it. I think the standout tracks for me were All Facts, New Drip, and I don't know how to say this one, but NAFR.
Yeah.
NAFR. I don't know what it says.
Yeah.
But
the piano one.
Yeah, I thought that was fantastic. But then, weirdly, because I've just really praised this album, but because of the rest of the playlist, it did still fade a little bit into the background for me. I think if it had been on last month's playlist, only Fiona Apple would have been better for me personally. But it did have a very strong playlist to be up against, I think. So yeah. What about you, Nick?
So in a way, I certainly take Matt's point that it shows the breadth of hip hop as a genre that you can have, as many genres that you can have something so just distinct from Run the Jewels and have this as well in existence, And I think a lot of the things you said, I see and I sort of also agree with, but I think I drew a different conclusion, honestly, at the end of that, which is you talk about like it being almost mumble, sort of a lot more smooth, a lot more laid back, and all these kind of terms. I found it really quite flat, and I don't really mean that in a complimentary way. I found it hard to get past how low key it was, and I couldn't really get into the sort of vibe of that. And I found his flow to match quite well. I suppose this is a compliment of sorts with the musical backdrop because both of them were very monotone, and I found that really hard to get into. In fact, at certain points, I would go so far as to say the album was soporific. At certain points, I found it was just one sort of quite long, even sort of flat playing field, which I again, for me, was really tough to get behind. So I didn't hate it. I don't really feel there were any particular standout tracks to me. Because I felt again like it was very consistently as it was, and to the extent that I think there was intent there, and I think he did want to make this kind of album, as far as I can tell. It seems like it wasn't like accidental. Then I suppose you got to give it to him for that he's done. He's created something that matches with a certain style. It's just not a style I can get behind, and so I won't be going back to it. I'll put it that way. So yeah, that's me on that one.
You have liked other albums of this sort of era, this part of hip hop, though, haven't you? I suppose this kind of.
I think it was one thing was musically speaking, it was very. I mean, there was no real development in a lot of the beats. Like I felt like it would start with a sample or a loop, and then it would just run for the entire track. In many cases, not all cases, in many cases, and I just felt like I wanted some growth and some arc, which I didn't really get out of this. So yeah, no, not really one for me that I was that keen on.
Fair enough. Okay, so were both of your favourites Run the Jewels from the playlist?
Of the whole playlist?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Matt?
Maybe.
Okay, Matt, what else is in... Go
Probably.
to whatever else is in contention for your favourite, then let's talk about
Yves Tumor.
that. Okay.
I really like this album, obviously. I think... I guess what I found about this one, it was kind of like dreamy. I'm going to use the word dreamy quite a lot for some of these albums, and it kind of drifted all over, but it was I guess compared to an album we haven't yet talked about, it felt dreamy in a very different way. It was very visceral, and so actually I found that to be really, really interesting, and like very kind of almost soothing, like I guess with everything that's going on at the moment, it just felt like that kind of aesthetic was just really like calming to me, and I guess going like through the album, my favorite track really was the opener, Gospel for a New Century. I just really, it's so big, bold, and like kind of brassy. It builds in a really interesting way to the chorus. It's kind of slow, and again, I think there was some really, really cool just bass lines in this playlist. For some reason, I got really focused on the bass lines, and again, had this really like meandering jazzy bass line that was super, super cool, and it just that really like it became an earworm for this month for me. I'd always be have that in my head, despite the fact that like RTJ Fat 4 has all these like absolutely like poppy hip hop like chartable songs, I guess, and this was the one that actually stuck with me, and I just generally throughout the album, again, the bass lines were really, I thought they were quite prominent in the songs. They were like very much holding, as they always do, they were very much holding the song together, but they were doing a lot of interesting things at the same time. And it was kind of quirky. And so I really enjoyed that. And then I hadn't really listened to Yves Tumor before.
No,
but
neither.
I really liked his vocals. It reminded me of the kind of coarseness of it, and reminded me of Dev Hynes a little bit, and Blood Orange, and just the whole like experimental vibe. This kind of of the whole album reminded me of maybe Blood Orange, but done better.
I thought about Blood Orange while listening to it, but I'll come to that in a bit. But is that you, Matt?
Oh, sorry, a lot more. Yeah, it just felt like a lot more was going on with it. And yeah, I was, I guess, intimidated by, like, I had a preconception of what Yves Tumor would be like. I'd heard that he's really into throbbing bristle, and I think I'd listened to him previously and been like, this is pretty intense and weird.
Yeah, from what I've read, I don't think you can. I don't think he's one of those artists that you can really predict with because each album's quite changeable. I think if you look on, I was looking on his Wikipedia earlier, and it has him down as an electronic ambient artist. So I think you just see someone who's changed a lot throughout their career, really. So yeah. So this was, I guess, a surprise, because I was like, wow, this is actually pretty easy for me to tune into and enjoy. Cool. Nick?
Yeah, sure. I'll jump on a couple of those things that you said there, actually. First of all, in terms of the bass parts, I actually also wrote down, I thought that was one of the strongest elements of the album was the bass piece kind of element, and how they had moved through tracks and sort of developed things out of them and danced around melodic structures, so I thought the bass parts were really good. I'll back up, though, and say on the other side, I suppose, I really don't agree about the vocals. I found the vocals quite difficult to get on board with, really. There were times when it sounded quite grating. In fact, there were even parts where harmonies, I think, didn't really work too well and sounded kind of off somehow. out of place or off kilter in some way, in a way that wasn't really pleasing to the ear. So for example, Kerosene, even the vocal feature on Kerosene, actually, not just Yves Tumor's voice himself, was also seemed a bit sort of slightly off pitch, and I found that really strange on an album that's like professionally produced. So anyway, I found that quite hard to get on board with. I think overall, first of all, when you talk about Blood Orange, I can sort of see where you're both going with that. But I actually thought it was a solo project, TV on the radio. Like the vocals actually sounded. I thought it was one of the singers at TV on the Radio's solo project for a while there before I bothered looking into it. But I don't think it's as good as TV on the Radio by quite a long way, actually. At least the stuff I like of theirs, like Dear Science and stuff, the earlier stuff. But so what was I going to say? I think a lot of times overall they had these strong parts and weaker parts, vocals versus bass and stuff. But a lot of these songs felt like they were throwing a lot of ideas on the wall to see what would work, and ways that didn't often come together. So I think Medicine Burn is a good example of a song that is kind of thrown, like trying to throw pieces in to sort of build something, and it all kind of fell apart. I felt still didn't sort of hold together. So I was kind of spoiled with this in the end. Overall, I found it sonically fairly tiring to listen to, and musically a little bit incoherent. So yeah, I wasn't really a fan, to be honest. Okay. That's me.
Well, we'll start with a big Nick's wrong, as usual.
Good.
So, but yeah, for me, this album was interesting in that I suppose I kind of maybe felt some of what Nick's talking about in my first few listens. For me, Matt, I would have answered this for your question about the least accessible album. I think the album,
I would have done that as well. I totally agree. Yeah.
I mean, it starts with Gospel for a New Century, which you mentioned, Matt, and I think as I got into it, from the opening bars of that song, I think you can tell this is going to be quite an interesting and involving album. I think that sort of stop-start beat that it starts with, it cuts out a few times. Kind of when you first hear it, makes you think maybe there's something going wrong with the record. It's not. Is it skipping? What's happening? I think actually it turns out to be quite a brave way to start an album, and I think it sets out the store because it turns into quite a pretty odd genre bending album that I think that it takes a lot of risks throughout, and for me, they're risks that pay off. I think it's really densely layered. There's so much going on, so many little nuances that I think actually I can imagine it being quite irritating to some people. I can imagine people finding this album really annoying or really loving it, and I think that's what maybe we're seeing a little bit here. For me, though, I found all those little details quite fascinating, and I found I got really lost in this album. I like how you can have one song like Identity Trade where it's really crunchy, quite distorted, but then you can go to a song like Kerosene, which Nick's just mentioned, where it's kind of a rock song. It's got the guitar solos, and I think the vocals are great on that track. And then you go to Hastel and Lights, which is an almost hip hop R&B track. So I think there's so many sounds, so many styles that I can see this album almost shouldn't work in some ways, but in the end, everything melds together really well for me. So I've mentioned a couple of tracks there that I really liked, but I really like this track, Romanticist, and particularly Strawberry Privilege, which is my favourite thing on this whole playlist. We're talking about the bass again. I think it's got such a funky little bass line. And then it also shows what the album's about with this strange, hypnotic, almost choral vocals. I think it's a really fascinating track, and I loved it. And yeah,
it's better than anything Run the Jewels. Then you're saying Strawberry Privilege. It's better than anything.
Yeah, and I prefer this album to Run the Jewels as well.
Wow.
Yeah, I bought this album.
Cool.
I think it's fantastic. Yeah. Okay, so that's us on Yves Tumor, isn't it? So I think I will, even though I've just praised. Actually, let's go to the classic. Let's talk about the classic. Let's talk about Jill Scott. I'll start us off.
Okay.
So the classic was Jill Scott. Who is Jill Scott? And I'll start with my negatives on this one. I found this album far too long. I thought, with it being the classic, that when I put the playlist together, I might have added one of those anniversary editions with a shitload of bonus tracks on. But I went and looked, and that wasn't the case. So yeah, that was a problem. It was rare for me that I could engage with this album as a whole just because of its length. But for me, that's a real shame. because there's some amazing moments on this album. I think the song Do You Remember, which is the first proper song on the album after the intro, is superb. I think her voice is really silky. It's got a really nice minimal beat, which relies heavily on some great percussion. It's really soulful. I remember when I first put this album on, I was out on a walk and that song came on and I was just thinking, oh, I'm going to absolutely love Jill Scott. And there are more moments like that on the album. I think Getting in the Way is a great track. I think A Long Walk is really good. He Loves Me, Love Rain, One is Magic, and Try. They're all great. So they're just all really timeless, soulful R&B songs, and I can see why Jill Scott's so highly rated. But those tracks I've just mentioned, that's enough for an album. And I think it'd be a really top drawer album if it just had those songs on. So I really like Jill Scott, but I don't know that I like this album as a whole because there's too much filler. And the length of it means it's going to be impossible for me to go back to it, really. So yeah, it's a mixed bag. I think I'll listen to more of her stuff, and she is a really good artist, but there's just no discipline on this album, really. Who wants to cut in?
Discipline.
Go for
I
it,
can
man.
jump
Yeah,
in.
go for it.
I actually, this is weird. Me and Fran are pretty much on the same page with a lot of this month, it seems. I would be maybe more critical of this album, I think, beyond just the length. And like, she's obviously hugely talented as a singer. Like the way she sings, it almost feels like with the like almost she sings and then she has some of like this speak singing and like this kind of patter. It almost feels like a lounge singer or something, like a 50s lounge singer, and you're going to a jazz bar. But I found that whole vibe kind of very enjoyable, especially after I think we had a bunch of albums that occupy a similar space for me in the playlist. We then get to this, and this is really different. I guess the main issues I have beyond the length is that it's just, and this is something we quite often talk about, it feels similar criticisms to like Fiona Apple's first album we talked about, in the sense that it feels very, very of its time in parts. And I use the word like in parts very like strongly. There are some songs where the organ and you have these sprinkly chimes, and the way the brass is incorporated, it just feels so very 90s or like late 90s, early 2000s. And that vibe of a very smooth, mellow R&B with that built in just it's not my jam at all. But then you do get other songs like Getting in the Way, which Fran mentioned, and He Loves Me, I think was my favorite, and they sound pretty contemporary. I think
that's what I mean by if they'd cut some of those songs out that we've mentioned. I mean, like the third song where she does the very much spoken word about having sex with a boyfriend, and it's kind of like, this sounds like something, from 1999 that would have been everywhere. But if those songs were in there, but I suppose at the time they were probably the songs that were maybe more successful. But now it feels like if you cut that away, you'd have a really great album here. But yeah, it's there's too much of that, definitely.
Yeah, every time I heard one of those like sprinkly chimes, like the wind chimes, I just laughed. I just couldn't take it seriously.
I didn't really notice these. I'm going to have to listen back for some sprinkly chimes.
They are everywhere.
Yeah. That's great.
But yeah, I'm glad I had this album. It's not like some of the classics we've covered recently I've really not been into. So this
it's
was
the best for a while, isn't it?
This was actually something really good.
So we go, this is slightly better than Yoko then, are we saying? Is that the agreement?
Slightly better than Yoko, a lot better than Neil Young.
Right.
She has slightly more talent, I think, than Yoko. I know.
That's fair to say. That is fair to say. Yeah, so shall I jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so this is, lots of things you said I'll also add to, but this is extremely, extremely beautiful album all the way through. The vocal... Her vocal ability is really off the charts. It's so full of emotion all the time. In fact, I have this sense that, which I'm sure is just an illusion, that she's smiling. I can hear her smiling as she sings. Do you know what I'm saying? I can hear the joy in what she's doing all the way through.
I really can't tell if you're going to drop some no, I'm talking shit thing, isn't it? Like you do sometimes, because I'm totally surprised that you've got any interest in this album. I'm waiting for you to turn around and go, no, I hated it.
No, this is on the level. Yeah. So I mean, I just thought, I just thought I had this sense to say that she was so happy to be doing this, and there was so much joy in it that I found that quite carried me along quite a long way. You know, I agree with Matt that it is quite a dated album. And I agree with you, Fran, actually, that it's also overly long. So I think both those criticisms stand. I don't think as an album for me, it has enough. It's just not a genre that I care about the nuances of enough. I don't think there's enough variety in it to keep me coming back a lot. But I mean, I'm glad we got to hear it. I'm glad I know it better than I did. I mean, it's just a very joyous thing to hear, which is nice. But
yeah, I'm really glad that we did it as well. I think for me, looking at her career, it's long career. I think it certainly makes me want to listen to more of her music, which a lot of the classics don't do sometimes. But it's interesting. I think just whether we'd still have some of those feelings if it had just been a bit shorter.
And I think that's and also this idea of the dated stuff. I mean, I think that's what is an album supposed to do about that? Really, it's a very difficult thing to, you know. If it suits us, then it won't suit us in a couple of years. You know, and the more it suits us, even you could argue in some cases, the less it will suit us in a couple of years. So, I don't know. That's really a challenging one for anyone, I think, to be timeless.
Yeah. Okay.
That's all I had to say about that one.
So Nick, do you want to start us off on? We've got LA Priest, Gene.
Sure.
Do you want to start us off, mate?
We'll do. Yeah. So it took me quite a long time to get any traction on this album. I sort of couldn't get it to gel, and I couldn't get a sense that the oddball structures of the songs really came together. A little bit like I was saying with Yves Tumor, that I didn't have this sense that the songs were coherent on a certain level. But then I realised actually that they were quite like, I feel like they were quite like Everything in the song construction stakes. And Everything is a band I really, really like. And also Everything is a band that I took a long time to get to like. I actually really was something I struggled with. And now I've really switched on to them. I absolutely love that band. I also hear some Wild Beasts in there, which is another band I really like. And I also hear something I wrote about recently, BC Camplight, which I'm not sure if either of you have heard yet. But anyway, that's an album that came out a couple of months ago, or a month ago even, that I did a review of on the site. And it sounds like that as well. So there really has very interesting, strange shapes to the way the songs are put together. So for example, there's this track, is it Rubber Sky, I think it is? And that track is basically a clean electric guitar, then a 3-part harmony drops into it, then it turns into a synth pop song, and then after that a sort of mid-tempo electronica sort of / EDM song to some extent. Then there's an electric guitar solo, and then it ends up with this sort of lo-fi synth melody to draw out at the end of the song. And the song, I think I'm right in saying, is only might be 3.5 minutes long or something. So he's making a lot of moves and really interesting ones in a very short space of time to pull something together that's coherent. I think that's really, really impressive. So yeah, and I thought my favourite track on the album was actually "Open My Eyes," which I really loved. And overall, I was really pleased that this album was on there on the list, and also that it came right after Around the Jewels, because it really gave me two sort of great albums to warm things up, you know, to sort of get me into the playlist. So. I really, really enjoyed it. Yeah, I thought it was great after some initial reservations.
Okay, I'm going to cut in because it's a couple of similar things. Yeah. But when you picked it, Matt, I'd never heard of LA Priest, and I don't know why, but I thought they were going to be an obnoxious rock band that I couldn't stand. I think maybe I was thinking of Judas Priest. I don't know.
Or maybe just making casting aspersions of LA as a town. Maybe that seems.
Yeah, I don't know. Just something about the name just didn't stand out to me.
Have you heard of Late of the Pier?
I since have realised that he's from Late of the Pier, but I've heard of them. I don't know them. So
I've never heard of them even. Yeah. No idea.
I've definitely heard of them, but I've not heard anything. But yeah, so it took me a little while with this album, as it did with a few of the albums on this playlist. It took me a little bit of a while to get my head around it, and going off some of my past reactions to albums on the podcast, I would guess that you guys might not think this would be my thing. I thought that too on the first couple of listens, but something kept dragging me back to it, and something other than that I have to listen to it for the podcast. Now it's weird, a lot of themes are coming up again and again tonight, but normally when I use the word catchy, I don't mean it positively. Normally catchy is an insult, but there was something so catchy, so earwormy about a lot of these songs, but not in an irritating way. Instead, it was just something that kept bringing me back, and I wanted to listen to them, and it became really involving. So I think there's a few reasons for that. I think the main one for me is that he does that rare thing of being able to create really addictive pop songs while also covering them in a layer of darkness. There's something in almost every song that stops it from sounding shiny or shimmery. They sound gritty at the same time as they sound poppy. And I love that there was different genres and influences that all live so well together. Like early on in the first song, it sounds a bit like the Talking Heads. Later, we've got Spanish guitar and elements that sound like they're influenced by Middle Eastern music. So I think the album's really well produced, and that it's like Nick just said, it's a hell of a feat to make all these sounds work so well together. So for me, I think in the end, this was one of the most fascinating albums I've heard in quite a long time, and it's probably my favourite album by a male artist so far in 2020, I would say.
Wow. Okay.
So yeah, I loved it.
Yeah.
Wow, that's cool. You done?
Yeah, I'm done, mate. Over to you.
Cool. Well, so as I kind of probably guessed, I am familiar with LA Priest. I was a big fan of Late of the Pier. Fran has definitely heard Late of the Pier before because
I've heard you play them.
It was on all the time when we used to go to indie clubs when we were back in university.
Yeah. Maybe if I heard a few songs, I might stick on their best known songs on Spotify later, and I'll probably recognise them all.
I've never heard them at all. Where are they from? Even I don't know anything about them.
I think that I don't know where they're English,
right?
And they were like 16,
probably somewhere near
releasing. Yeah, I think they're just from like some dead end town in England, and they were big in the late 2000s.
Sorry, I don't know why. No, I'm just saying like London. I was just slaying London for some reason. I don't know what the problem is. Just aggro today.
That's how far followers got.
Yeah.
But yeah, they made the really like indie synth stuff that was super popular at that time. But
I remember them being around with like the Maccabees and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, but they were way weirder and way more kind of out there. And for most of the time when they were big, it was before they actually released the album. So it was like that whole thing of like sharing tracks through sharing services and shit like that. And then he obviously he disappeared off the grid. He was the main musical force behind it. And then he came back with LA Priest. And so like compared to his prior album, this was, I think, I actually preferred it less. Okay. I think this was a more like we've talked about different descriptors for this, but I think this was a little bit more ethereal, and I actually prefer the kind of weirder angular synth pop that it was in the previous album. That said, I still really like this. It obviously at moments it felt like I was listening to Metronomy, so like there are definitely moments where it fits with that vibe, and I think he has a similar like approach to music, but I
think it's that darkness that I was talking about that's missing from Metronomy, that maybe that's why I couldn't get too on board with Metronomy, is it is very shimmery, very shiny, whereas this felt like there was always something that was condensing it a little bit and making it a bit darker.
Which is very Wild Beast as well. I feel like that Wild Beast association is very valid in that respect.
I hadn't thought of that. But
particularly things like What Moves, if that's the track What Moves.
Yeah, What Moves is amazing.
It could be off. Could be a B-side off a Wild Beast album. Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, especially with the vocal stylings as well. But yeah, like despite like those drawbacks of not being his previous album, I really enjoyed it.
I feel like you found a really long way to say I like his first album better then, didn't you? Really?
Yeah. Basically, I want you to listen to his first album to see what you think. I'm like really surprised that you guys were really into this, so I'm a little bit reeling from that.
Yeah.
But I guess because I have criticisms that like it came, especially after it came after RTJ4 as well. It just feels pretty meek in comparison.
But it's a totally different thing, isn't it? It's a totally different.
Yeah. And so I found it, again, it's like talking about the playlist is really interesting, its placement in the playlist, because even though like Medhane, LA Priest and Yves Tumor are very different, they occupy the same kind of mental space for me of like this more dreamy, ethereal more descriptors that I can't think of right now.
Are you the one
I
who's
certainly see
hungover, or
links
is it
between
me?
Yves Tumor and LA Priest. I can see links between those two quite strongly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can as well. Although I think to me the LA Priest works so much better. It comes together a way the Yves Tumor does not. I think
I
they're
do
both
think
trying
it's
to
a
do a
better
similar
album.
thing. Yeah,
I think they're both great, but I do think it's a better album.
Yeah, I don't know. But I guess because of the way it is, it got into my like more subconscious, and like I couldn't help but like there were so many times I was listening to this album, and then I noticed that I'm like really bobbing my head along, and I'd be doing other stuff, and I'd have that in the background, and it would be demanding attention, even though it is this kind of more laid back sound.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think obviously there's some really poppy songs on it, like What Moves. But I think the song I actually really enjoyed the most was What Do You See, which was really weird. It had this like with the disco-y guitar, and then this really weird shifted vocals where he sounded like very like feminine, and then the way the way he was singing almost sounded like I don't know how to describe it, but because I'm not familiar with the music well enough, but like it sounded almost like some like Southeast Asian music, with like a sitar or something.
That's what I meant by the different influences from all over the place. The Middle Eastern influence is certainly in there. I think it's that's what's so interesting about it. I think it just seemed to meld all different things together. For me, my favourite song was "Kissing of the Weeds," which is another really really odd one, but it's weird mix of genres, I think.
Yeah, it's really I found it super interesting. I wasn't expecting this from him. I was expecting to get even more like a super clean synthy pop, but then I should have expected this because he's super weird and experimental. So
there we go.
That's good.
All right, well I think that's kind of those five. So we're going to talk about the playlist as a whole. Nick, you seem to be the least blown away by the playlist, so I'm going to go to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think that's probably right, but I would say it's still a very strong list compared to a lot of the ones that come through the door here. So, I mean, I feel like it's got two really great albums, and then one that's Jill Scott that's solid, just not really for me. And then the Medhane, okay, I suppose. And then I didn't like the Yves Tumor. So, I'd say overall it's a strong list. It's a strong list.
Matt?
One of the best lists we've ever done.
Yeah.
I loved almost everything. So there wasn't a bad album.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. I think it's I was trying to think back, and the playlist I always compare to in my head is the one when we had Idols, US Girls, Sugar Cubes. I can't remember what else, but this for me is actually the best playlist we've had. I bought two of the albums on vinyl. I didn't dislike anything. There was no album that I didn't want to listen to, which I don't think ever happened before. So for me, I think best playlist we've had possibly.
What was the second vinyl you bought?
I bought the LA Priest and the Yves Tumor.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, bought them both.
Bought the Run the Jewels. You didn't do that.
Well, the Run the Jewels isn't out yet on vinyl, but also I need more time with that album. I think it's I do really like it, but I don't know. I think maybe because I was listening to it alongside those two that I was really, really, really into, they were more prominent for me this month. But yeah, I maybe will buy it. It's certainly on the possible list.
Great.
Nice.
Great.
Shall I talk about Tracy Chapman?
Please do, yeah. Tell us all about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have included Tracy Chapman as her debut album, which is self-titled. I'm going to have to go pretty far back in time to talk about why I love Tracy Chapman. And that's not just because it's the furthest I've gone back for an artist I've chosen to talk about, as in the earliest music that's come out, but also because I would say Tracy Chapman was probably my first ever favourite artist. So I would have been 4 years old when this album came out in 1988, and I have really strong, distinct memories of listening to this album on my dad's record player and in his car. I remember being totally obsessed with it. And I'm not sure if I was 4 or a bit older when this happened, but I also have a really distinct memory of listening to this album in my bedroom on my cassette player, singing every word into a hairbrush and pretending that I was Tracy Chapman performing in front of thousands of people. I clearly remember that.
Nice.
And I so badly wanted to be able to sing like her, and I probably still do. To be fair, she has one of the best voices I've ever heard. But what's really interesting to me about that, looking back now, is trying to wrap my head around what this 4 or 5 year old Fran felt so connected to, because these are, in the main part, some really heavy and deep songs about things I really hope I didn't fully understand at that age. I suppose I've mentioned the voice. That's one thing that I was probably connecting to, and the melodies are really clear. They're really involving. But yeah, it's interesting. I just think it's interesting that I was so into this album at such a young age. But what's also fascinating to me is that this is an album that's lived with me ever since then. I've probably listened to this album in every one of the 32 years since it came out. Some years a lot more than others, but I probably have listened to it at least a few times in each one of those years. And I have memories of this album at different parts of my life. I remember when Boyzone covered Baby Can I Hold You when I was 14. And I got into an argument with someone at school who insisted that Ronan Keating had written it. And I actually came in the next day with my Walkman and made them listen to the original version of it. And then I remember introducing friends to it in my late teens and early 20s and being really pleased when one of them in particular fell totally in love with it as well. And then I remember, just as I was starting to think about collecting records and starting to get a record player, seeing this in a stack of secondhand records at Levenshulme Market and making it the first record I ever actually bought for myself.
Perfect. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Nice.
So, and I remember bringing that record home. I remember soon getting my record player not long after that and introducing my girlfriend Kirsten to the album after that, which, is another great memory of it. And I think about like other music that my parents played at that time. Some of it's returned to my collection after a big gap, like stuff like Bob Marley, Bob Dylan and David Bowie. But other stuff that I really remember listening to as a kid, stuff like The Proclaimers and Van Morrison, might occasionally get a nostalgia listen, but it's been pretty much, cast aside. I'm not going to be going out and buying those albums. So I've spent a lot of this last month thinking what it is about Tracy Chapman that is different. And I think actually in this last month while we've been listening to it, with the backdrop of the Black Lives Matter protests and renewed focus on poverty and domestic violence due to the lockdown, that kind of shows why this album is so enduring. I think songs like Talking About a Revolution, Fast Car, Behind the Wall, Mountain of Things, and particularly Across the Lines could have been written today. They've lost absolutely none of their relevance. And they also could have actually been written by someone during lockdown, and they all would have made sense of this situation. So I think it's just such an important, timeless album for those reasons, and I can't think of many albums that have that sort of power that lasts for so long. And I think, listening to it over the last month's been a really, really good thing for me, because I can really see the quality of this album, and that it's not just a nostalgia thing. It's not just something that I have memories of. It's actually still really, really important. I think it's one of the all-time greats, and I don't think it will ever sound irrelevant. But yeah, that's all I really wanted to say about it. I'd love to know what you guys thought. And before you tell me what you thought of it in general, I just wondered what you guys knew of, because obviously she's been a huge part of my life. I've always listened to her, but I wonder if you guys even knew of her or knew the album before I put it on the list. So who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, it's this album totally sucked. I hate it. No. So I thought, I did know about her, and I remember when this first came out, because I'm older than you, and remember being impressed with it. That whenever it was, I was pretty young as well, but I have a recollection of liking it at the time. I think overall, I find I'm kind of fascinated by your taste, Fran, on this in a way, because the production is quite small, and my sense is, and I've got my son is 11. His taste in music is mostly wants to be more clear cut, wants to be less subtle than that. So wants to be like, I don't know, like he likes AM, for example, very much, which is not saying it's a bad album, but it's very clear cut, on off. The melodies of a shout out. And this is something that's very slight in lots of ways, not politically, but musically. I think politically it has a lot to say that's relevant now. Yeah, absolutely. So I'd really enjoyed it. I would say that it does sound, going back to that question we were talking about with the Jill Scott about the datedness of it. It does. Maybe it's because I recollect it, but it just does seem very not lyrically, but musically of that time, of that like early 90s, late 80s kind of time. But I don't think it's I think that's a particularly bad thing. I mean, I just think that's where it's from and that's its roots, and I think you can kind of embrace that, really. Yeah. So I really enjoyed it, and I find it interesting. You say about it being your favourite vocals as well, though. Her voice is sometimes it's an acquired taste, I would say. I'll put it that way.
Do you think?
I think sometimes her vibrato is so fast that it can be like not as pleasing to the ear, but that just sometimes. I don't know. It's not a big deal. But yeah. So anyway, generally, I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad we put it on the list. Yeah.
Cool. Matt.
Yeah. So. I was born like obviously a year after this, so I didn't get to hear it when I was a kid. And I think that made me think that maybe there's a thing of like, to me this seems timeless, but I didn't live through hearing all the music sound like this, like I did with Jill Scott. I don't have the touchstones for what music in
right
apart from the specifically good albums that I've gone back to listen to. So maybe that is one of the reasons that I think, to me, that this is it feels like a timeless album. Like I know Tracy Chapman, and I don't particularly know how. I don't have a reference point for when she entered my life exactly. But I've always really appreciated her music. Like Fast Car is such a integral part of like culture that I've heard people randomly like riff on it, and everyone understands what they're talking about.
Yeah, it's weird that song stands out as one that's so many cover versions of it, so many different, and it just like weirdly to me that song's so huge, but it's never felt like she is as huge as that song, if that makes sense. It's a weird one.
Yeah. Like everyone knows Fast Car, and I think everyone knows it's Tracy Chapman, but maybe people haven't sat down and listened to the album that goes with it that elevates her to a fantastic artist and not a one-hit wonder kind of thing.
Is there a lot more of her music than this? I mean, how much has she done?
So I'll be honest with you, I know there's another album afterwards. My sense is that there's no more than 3 albums, but if I'm being totally honest, I listen to the rest of her music. It doesn't have the same power as this album, I don't think. So there's some great songs. I think it's well worth digging into it because there's some other great songs. But I think this was the big album for her, and I think one after. Yeah.
Right. So I'll cut you off there, Matt. Carry on.
Oh no, it's all good. Yeah, like a lot of like what Fran, you were talking about, Fran. Yeah, like she is phenomenal. I love her voice.
Yeah, her voice is amazing.
I'm like I think the fact that she can do like Behind the Wall, do an a cappella song, and it doesn't feel like it's missing anything. It's because of her voice that she can do that. I don't think it's no like happenstance that she can pull that off while other artists would fail. And I think the biggest thing about listening to her for like this solid month, which has been really nice, is that I've been able to reclaim Baby Can I Hold You from Boyzone. Because that was the version I grew up with and was in my head. And the first few listens were really painful. But I sweated through it. I got it out of my system.
You're crying into your pillow.
Well, it's the funny thing when I was talking about buying this on record and playing it to Kirsten at first, and that was the exact same thing with that. Like she couldn't get past that. Every time that song came, she was like, I kept playing it like, you love this album, don't you? You've got to love this album. And she was like, well, it's got that Boyzone song in it. It's not a fucking Boyzone song. Stop calling it a fucking Boyzone song. And it took a while for her to get past that as well, and that fucking infuriated me when they covered that. And then I remember actually even worse, there was, I don't know if either of you remember a guy called Darius on X Factor.
No.
Or Pop Idol, one of those way back in the day, like when I was probably 13, 12. He covered it. He covered Boyzone's version of it, and I was just sat on the sofa watching it. I wanted to smash something because it was like 3 levels of absolute torture. It was just so bad, but at least I suppose maybe that got a name out there a little bit, but who knows.
Nice.
Have you finished, Matt?
Probably just I think I'm really glad we got to spend a month with this because it's
and it lifted this
fantastic.
playlist as well. When you asked about how the playlist was in general, this obviously helped to up the average, So
Yeah. I mean,
so
I can't
overall,
say that was probably helped me when I'm saying it's my favourite playlist ever, is that I had one of my very favourite albums at the end of it.
Exactly.
That probably helps. And I think it's nice. One thing I thought doing this as well is just a lot of the time when I do my Why I Loves, I do a playlist because of someone's career is what I'm into, but it was nice to just have an album that was so meaningful to me because it is just the album that I really care about. Because I think I love the album as a form, and that's why I love doing this podcast, and I love reviewing albums because I think it's such an important form. But I think it's getting more and more lost. So I think it was really nice just to have a great album on the end of it.
Yeah.
For a change.
Right. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, I think that's us.
Okay.
So thanks, guys. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Let's talk about next time.
Yep.
Was there anything else? Yeah, let's talk about next time. So next time, we haven't had a guest on the playlist for a little while. You may have noticed because of obviously lockdown. We've been unsure of how it would work. We had a few people lined up, and it just wasn't going to work the way we've been doing it. So we are going to try and have a guest next time, which is James Spearing, who's one of the writers, one of the editors on pickyourbees.com, which, by the way, if you've not been to pickyourbees.com, you should go.
pickyourbees.com right now.
Yes.
Come on.
So, if you've not heard enough of us in this last hour, there's more of us there.
You can listen to other people.
You can.
Awesome.
You can.
Read other people.
Yes. So James is going to join us next time. So he's going to introduce Miles Davis as his Why I Love. So we're going from one classic to another by the sounds of it. His classic pick is Marine Girls with Beach Party, and his recent release is Madrugada by MJ Cole. I'm going to pick the latest Bob Dylan album, Rough and Rowdy Ways, is my recent release.
And I'll be doing Quell, Chris, and Chris Key's Innocent Country 2.
That's too many Chris's in one.
I know, it is a very confusing name, yeah.
And then the final pick is Arca from me with Kick Eye. I think that's how you say it.
About, so it'll be interesting, that one.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm excited.
Cool. Right. Thanks, guys. See you next time.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.